So I would like to dedicate my talk today to Steve Armstrong and Kamala Masters. And at the end of my talk, I'd like to play a brief reflection that Steve gave last July at the Insight Meditation Society. So, as I said, being our own gatekeeper, mindfulness of skillful understanding and right view. In the Buddha's first discourse to the monks that he was first on the path with, he brought up the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Understanding that there is suffering, understanding that suffering is caused by clinging and craving, understanding that cessation is possible, and laying out a path for freedom. How do we keep these alive in our daily lives? This is how it goes for me around craving on a regular basis. I was having a conversation with myself sitting at the table, satisfied from having had a bowl of wonton soup and immediately imagining what I wanted next. Some crackers with peanut butter or cheese, the ripe avocado I had sitting in the fruit bowl, or perhaps a cup of tea. I was noticing craving, noticing desire, and then stopping a moment to look at the root of that craving. Then I looked over at my dog, Raja, and I thought, what does he get to eat? Dog food in a play toy, dog food in a buoy that bobbles around, so he has to hit it to get his dog food. Dog food softened and put in a Kong or a bone with peanut butter on the end. He gets no variety whatsoever. And then, of course, he has craving to have more, or have me play with him, or go for a walk. This is the beginning of looking at right view, or understanding in the first truth of the Eightfold Path. I'm remembering a recent talk by Ajahn Amaro, a wonderful British-American monk in the Ajahn Chah lineage. I know some of you have heard of him. He gave a talk a while back at Amaravati, the monastery where he's the abbot in England, and he was talking about the way he approached renunciation when he was a young monk. He had just joined when he was 21 years old. He was, as he says, eager to get on with this monk business. He shared that there's a certain word that's used in Pali, the language that was spoken at the time of the Buddha, around how a monk can approach their alms rounds and food intake. They can train themselves deeper by making various choices. One of them is to only eat what is given to them in their bowl on the alms round, and they don't receive any other food that's offered from the monastery meal serving. And he says you only eat it at one time out of that bowl and not again that day. The fact that he was 21 was rather telling because they line up in order of seniority. And so he was at the very end of the line of monks. He could see what was ahead. They were living outside a village in which the villagers were taught to grow corn and beans. So they had agriculture there. And so there was some good food provided. He could get close enough in the line to be able to see that there were 5 ears of corn left. And then he counted how far back he was in the line. Well, he was not going to get any corn. The whole scenario of craving and clinging and disappointment was brought directly into view. It's pretty humorous to imagine. And he was actually chuckling when he was telling the story. This constant craving that occurs in the mind is really worth looking at. We can see so directly the suffering that happens in the heart and mind. And we continue practicing mindfulness to see where to let go. Letting go of unskillful and continuing training the mind to see clearly what is happening When we don't, it just runs all over the place. Like my dog, when he's looking for bits of dog food that I throw out and I tell him to go find it. Running here and running there, trying to find a little bit of a treat. My mind is like everyone else's, runs here and there, grasping after what it wants to satisfy its next craving. And this is why we train ourselves and embrace the discipline that's needed, understanding the Four Noble Truths, investigating the Eightfold Path, embracing ourselves and others with kindness and compassion. Here I'll mention some about the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. They're not steps to be followed in sequence one after the other. They can be more aptly described as components rather than steps, comparable to the intertwining strands of a single cable or a rope that requires the contributions of all the strands for maximum strength. With a certain degree of progress, all 8 factors can be present simultaneously, each supporting the others. But until that point is reached, some sequence in the unfolding of the path is inevitable. Considered from the standpoint of practical training, the 8 path factors are divided into 3 themes. And the word right is used. It can also be understood to mean skillful. So the first group of factors is the wisdom factors, right view or right understanding, and right intention or right thinking. And then there's moral discipline, which is ways of living harmoniously with others, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And the next group of factors is concentration, and that's right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Some people put right view and right intention as the last 2, but my understanding and my teaching was that the right view of understanding the Eightfold Path is what, then the Four Noble Truths is what is first, and then right thinking or right intention is what is second. So skillful view or right understanding, right view, it's Sammā Diṭṭhi in Pali. Right view is the wisdom to look at existence from the perspective of the Four Noble Truths, which includes the Eightfold Path. It involves understanding that suffering or unsatisfactoriness is a universal characteristic of existence. If we live, we suffer. We can be dissatisfied and have stress. Right view involves seeing that there are causes to suffering. Let's consider the first discourse by the Buddha after his awakening. He was giving this talk to 5 of his previous monk friends who had abandoned him because he no longer took the same path that they did. And he was telling them that through his clear seeing, he understood the importance of avoiding 2 extremes that were common practices in those days. To avoid indulgence in sensual pleasure, and to avoid that which is devoted to self-affliction and pain. I'm sure you've heard stories of, people laying on beds of nails, and that there were ways of self-affliction, which was one form of practice at the time, and another one was indulging in sensual pleasure, which actually was the way the Buddha was first brought up, as the prince in his palace, indulging in all of the sensual pleasures. Both paths he'd followed, and he didn't find complete freedom from suffering in either path. He said, quote, "Avoiding both of these extremes, the middle way, realized by the Tathagata, which means the enlightened one, producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, and to complete freedom, end quote. Then he shared the 4 truths that he discovered for himself, which we are also encouraged to discover for ourselves. He went on to say, and what is the middle way realized by the Tathagata, the enlightened one, that leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding? Precisely this noble Eightfold Path: right view, right resolve or thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is the middle way realized by the Tathagata, that producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. In several discourses, the Buddha elaborates on right view, making an interesting distinction between what we might call worldly or mundane right view. That's the understanding that leads to worldly ease and happiness, and supermundane right view. Those understandings lead to liberation, complete freedom from suffering. Right view or understanding is the understanding that things as they are, understanding things as they are. And it's the 4 noble truths that explain things as they really are. According to the Buddha, there are 2 sorts of understandings. We generally call understanding as knowledge, as accumulated memory, an intellectual grasping of a subject according to certain given perceptions and data. And this is referred to as knowing accordingly, anubbodha. And it's considered not a very deep understanding. Real dharmic understanding, or penetration, pativeda, is seeing a thing in its true nature, without name, without label, without creating perceptions about it. Just like when we say allow sound to come to the ears, without identifying it. And this is possible when the mind is free from impurities of greed and hatred and delusion, and it's fully developed through meditation. This dharmic understanding or penetration in seeing things in their true nature. Right understanding, therefore, is ultimately reduced to the understanding of the 4 noble truths. We can perceive right or skillful in terms of insight into the noble truths. It is a view that helps us realize them for ourselves. This understanding is the highest wisdom, which sees the ultimate reality of liberation, freedom from suffering. Gil Fronsdale, whom you may have heard me refer to, one of my favorite teachers at Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California, says, for the Buddha's path, this orienting perspective called right view is the practice of keeping an eye on our relationship to whatever we're experiencing. Classically, this is described as using the perspective of the 4 noble truths, rather than getting caught up in our opinion and abstract interpretations of what we're experiencing. In this approach, we ask ourselves a series of questions. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and just rest your eyes and pause, and ask you if you can imagine a situation where you may have recently felt stress. And ask yourself, do I feel any stress, discomfort, or suffering in how I'm relating to what's happening or not happening? And then we ask ourselves, what is my contribution to this suffering? What am I clinging to that's contributing to the suffering? Take a few moments to contemplate that, and then when you want to open your eyes, I'm going to ask if anyone wants to share something that they noticed. I can come up with something, but I want somebody else to go first if you'd like to. I came home from a recent trip to find that my house was in a big mess. And the dog was unkempt, and he had a red and swollen eye, and I had to make an appointment with the vet. So this caused me a bunch of stress. And my partner was in the hospital. And so when I really asked myself, what is my contribution to this suffering? What am I clinging to, or what isn't happening? Well, what wasn't happening was the house wasn't neat, the dog wasn't quite as healthy as he could have been, and but once I realized that I wanted it to be a different way than it was, and that it caused constriction in my mind, and that was contributing to my suffering. I wanted to come home to a cleaner environment, but shortly after some reflection of my mind state, I realized that I was clinging to the desire of having it be different, and I was able to do what I needed to do and get it done without resentment. But it takes that momentary awareness as soon as we notice stress or discomfort to notice how we're actually contributing to the suffering. Anybody else want to share?
I would just say, I don't really want to get up to use the microphone, but that control, wanting control for me is often the cause of suffering. So wanting to be able to, kind of a form of what you're talking about, wanting it to be the way you want it to be.
Right. Let me tell the people on Zoom what you said. So it was stated here in the room that one of the aspects of suffering is control, and how we want things to be the way they want them to be. Yeah. And as soon as we start noticing, oh, this is what's happening, we can ease that control a little. Try to, anyway. So right view includes the encouraging perspective that clinging and its resulting suffering can be brought to an end. And it also orients us to the practices of the entire Eightfold Path as the easiest and clearest path to liberation from suffering. Right view isn't meant to be the only perspective from which to view our life. Other perspectives can be necessary for other purposes. However, in order to walk the Buddha's path to freedom, skillful view is essential. It's the perspective needed to find the path and to stay on the path. Practicing right view does not require believing something that we can't know for ourselves. It doesn't rely on any supernatural or mystical beliefs, nor does it require to be ahead of where we are. Pursuing a path involves walking where we are on the path. We can't walk on what lies ahead until we reach it. Sayadaw U Tejaniya, a living Burmese monk in Myanmar, says, when the mind judges or has a preference for an experience to be better, then it will automatically develop a reaction of the opposite if the opposite happens. So right view is to have no preferences. For example, sound is just sound. It's nature. So let's remember that these wisdom factors of the Eightfold Path are right view, right intention, or right thought. Bhante Gunaratana, a monk in his 90s in West Virginia, who's written very accessible books. One is called 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. And he says, According to the Buddha, our minds are naturally luminous. In each moment, as consciousness first arises, its spark is bright. In the unenlightened mind, however, that spark gets covered up by the impurities of greed, hatred, and delusion. These impurities obstruct the mind's brightness, leaving the mind dark and miserable. We cannot say that the mind is already pure. We must do the work to make it that way. We have to cleanse this luminous mind to let it shine without any impurities blocking its brightness. He goes on to say, wisdom, cultivated through mindfulness, burns away the obstruction of greed, hatred, and delusion. The more we remove them, the more the mind becomes comfortable and happy and radiant. Mindfulness also keeps impurities from arising. Therefore, the deeply hidden secret of happiness is this truth. He says happiness comes from within our own minds. Through the use of mindfulness to clear away grasping, ill will, and confusion, this secret of happiness is revealed as the layers of impurities are peeled off through wisdom. Bhante also says practicing mindfulness makes quarreling with the world seem ridiculous. We don't cut off our hand when it does something wrong. Similarly, it's silly to cut ourselves off from people who do things differently from us. All of us partake of the same ever-changing, ever-suffering nature. Quarreling with the world is like one arm fighting with the other, or the right eye battling the left. What does all this mean? All of these specific declarations rest on the framework of understanding the law of karma, the understanding that the only things that truly belong to us are our actions and their results. Jack Kornfield mentions that according to the law of karma, the results of our actions follow us like a shadow. When we integrate this realization into our lives, we pay more attention to our choices and actions and to where they're leading. In the Buddha's description of mundane right view, held in the context of the law of karma, he elaborated a few particular areas of investigation and practice. The first statement, there is what is given, what is offered, and what is sacrificed, refers to the moral and the karmic significance of generosity. Acts of giving have power. The Buddha emphasized this in his well-known teaching that said, if we knew as he did about the fruits of giving, we wouldn't let a single meal pass without sharing it. A question for us then is how, in our fast-paced, individualistic culture, can we actually make generosity a practice? One of the ways that Joseph Goldstein mentions in his book Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening, is to act on each of those moments of generous impulse. If I have a thought, he says, to give, whether a small gesture or something bigger, I try to act on it at the appropriate time, rather than letting the thought simply pass, or second-guessing myself. Acts of generosity bring obvious benefits to the recipient, but they also bring benefit to ourselves, not only in the moment, but also when these wholesome karmic actions bear fruit. Every time we give, we're strengthening associated factors of metta and of letting go, of renunciation in those moments. We have friendly, loving feelings toward the recipient at the same time that we're letting go. And if we consciously reflect on the whole process, then the practice of generosity also fosters the growth of wisdom. I think about this every time I fill a bag to donate to Goodwill, even though there might be some things I reluctantly give up. I give it happily, and I'm reminded that someone else will be very happy when they find one of my items. There are other phases of the description of mundane right view. It's a long and complicated subject for many Dharma talks, but I will mention that there is no way to overestimate the importance of the teachings on the fruit and results of good and bad actions. That our actions bring results, that we are their heirs, the owners of our actions. Putting this understanding into practice enables us to engage creatively with our lives, knowing that our choices, and more precisely, our motivations, shape how our lives unfold. We begin to take a much greater sense of responsibility for what we do, knowing that it has consequences both in the moment and for the future. What we can remember is that any action that comes from a mind under the influence of greed, hatred, or delusion leads to suffering and is unskillful. And the opposite is true. Any action that comes from a mind not under the influences of grasping, ill will, or confusion brings happiness and is skillful. I can give you a small example that happened a while back. I was having to go on a drive from Portland to Beaverton at 5 o'clock during rush hour. And it was almost dark and raining. All of the lights on the highway, cars rushing to go on and off entry ramps, and the reflection of the headlights on the wet pavement. And I was the passenger, and I was in a rush to go pick up my car at a certain time. And we were stuck in traffic. So you know what happens. The mind is immediately filled with dissatisfaction, anger, ill will at the drivers. After a little while, mindfulness kicked in, and I was able to see the constricted state of mind that I was in, and began actually wishing everyone in each of those cars to be filled with kindness. And there were a lot of them coming and going. And I wished them to be safe and protected in getting where they were going. And shortly after that, I realized with happiness that the state of this mind had changed. And I was no longer producing these unskillful thoughts. I had begun to access skillful thoughts. The proclamation of the Four Noble Truths, knowing there is suffering or dukkha, understanding dukkha as clinging and craving, understanding the path as a way out, and having the ability to access it through renunciation and letting go of the unskillful thoughts, and substituting those thoughts with kind and skillful ones, will have an effect on our present and future way of being. It leads to a momentary cessation of dissatisfaction. When we take responsibility for our intentional actions, we change our behavior. The Buddha's teachings describe an accessible path to liberation. The ancient Buddhist metaphor of a path draws on the idea of a cleared passageway that allows one to move through an otherwise impassable forest. Just as a person brings their entire body along when we're walking on a path in the forest, so a spiritual practitioner enters the Buddhist path by engaging all the aspects of who they are. Yet while a physical path exists, whether we walk it or not, the Buddhist path exists only in our engagement with it. We create the path with the activities of our minds, of our hearts and bodies. The teachings about the Buddhist path are simply maps, indicating how we create the path as we go. In one version of this path metaphor, the Buddha likens spiritual liberation to a long forgotten, overgrown city deep in the forest. Just as it's possible to reclaim and then inhabit this city, once the path is found, it's possible to live a liberated life when we discover and follow a path that will take us there. Building on the metaphor of the forest path, the Buddha compared the forest's dense undergrowth to the many mental and emotional objects that limit our freedom. We each have our own inner wilderness with its dangers and challenges, but we also have within us what it takes to free ourselves from these dangers. Because both the path and the obstacles are found within us, the Buddhist path requires us to take responsibility for our thoughts, attitudes, and actions. It builds on the principle that we can move forward towards liberation by disengaging from views and behaviors that weigh us down, and by replacing them with behaviors that lighten us and support us as we proceed. There's a lot more in this conversation about super-mundane right view and those understandings that lead onward to nibbana and total freedom, the subtlety of wrong view, enhancing right view of non-self, and observing the changing nature of the aggregates. But for now, I think I've given you enough to contemplate. And if any of it seemed too complicated, don't worry about it. Just let it wash over you. You'll hear it, more of it, right view or skillful understanding in different ways over the years of your practice. So let me check the time. I think I'll skip this other story, although it was an interesting one. So what we want to kind of ask ourselves is, can we be with the complexities of life, open to them, surround them with compassion, and let the wisdom of investigation hold us in its fullness? Can we be with them with bare attention, seeing, being with, knowing and noting the transient nature of the experience? We can look to nature, even just looking out the window, walking down the street, or going into the forest. This goes along with the path metaphor as we take up this inner journey, making our way through our tangled emotions. So let's just sit for a while and let the words settle down for a few minutes. One of Sayadaw U Tejaniya's quote says, "Right view is the idea that mental and bodily processes are nature. They have their own nature, and they're showing that nature to us. That's something to learn from. If we can tap into this truth, then we won't struggle so much. We won't be buying into the story, why is this happening to me?" And using the Buddha's image of an overgrown forest path, liberation is described as something we uncover rather than attain. Each moment of clear seeing helps clear the way, allowing us to meet life with greater compassion, steadiness, and freedom. So thank you so much for listening to the Dharma. I appreciate being able to share it with you. I hope that you've you're able to keep some of it that works and let the rest go. And some of it will seep into you and come out in skillful thoughts and actions another time. So may we navigate our own overgrown forest with mental and emotional obstacles that limit our freedom. We each have our own inner wilderness with its dangers and challenges, but we also have within us what it takes to free ourselves from these dangers. I'd like to end this, if it will come through the sound. I don't know if it will, but I'm going to try. It's coming through the wrong microphone. Well, I think I'm going to let it go because I would rather have feedback from people online and people in person, some of the reflections that you have from the talk. So I'm going to take a moment here to pause the recording.